Welcome to the session on overcoming hurdles, which I have to say is it was a session title that was handed to us, so it's been kind of an interesting odyssey for us to take that title and imagine what it could have been in the mind of the person who invented it. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But I want to say just at the outset, as opposed to having we're going to present and then you ask questions, we're viewing this more as an interactive session. It's a small room. There's not that many of us. And we haven't actually prepared really refined talks. So I think this really should be a conversation as opposed to us lecturing. Maybe I will go ahead. Okay. You've got a clicker.
I've got the clicker.
Okay. So why don't you say a few words about yourself, Liz?
Okay. And by the way, in terms of who gave us this title, this was a write-in to a survey. This was a poll for people like you. And this was not one of the ones that we envisioned. And this was a write-in. So obviously this is of concern for you. So this is something that we really want to make sure to take care of. I've been at the University of Colorado since I got my PhD. I love to ski and bike. Boulder's a great place. And I think if we both sit here, especially since we're going to talk like this. And I've had a variety of really interesting fellowships where I've gotten to talk to people from all different walks of science and engineering, which has been just one of the highlights of my life. And I've been on the CCC for 6 years now, and I've been the vice chair since July 1st. So.
All right, and so I did my PhD at Penn. Like Liz, I've had a lot of really interesting opportunities in my career to experience different cultures and different approaches to doing research and in academia in general. I was a Fulbright Fellow in Germany for about a year and a half. Happened to be a good time to be there. It was in '88, '89 when the wall between East and West Berlin came down. Was on the Yale faculty for about 8 years, moved to Hopkins just about 19 years ago now. And at that, went there actually as originally just as a plain old professor, but they had an ERC there, so I became a research director of that ERC while I was at Hopkins. So I had a chance to see how big research organizations function. I actually did a sabbatical at Stanford for a year, came back, and as Greg Morris had said, they were open for the department chair shortly after I got back, and apparently my reactions were slowed by my sabbatical, so while everyone stepped back, I didn't move quickly enough. So I became department chair for a few years. I also, around that time, got involved in the CCC, so I was on the council starting in, I think, 2011. And so I became chair of the CCC in 2014, did that for a couple of years. And now I'm the found director. That's actually probably right. I am a founding director of the Malone Center for Engineering in Healthcare.
Doctor, hold the microphone a little bit closer.
Sure. Or I can sit closer to it.
And by the way, I would say about hurdlers, hurdlers are quite amazing athletes. And I got to watch the hurdlers in 1988. And they can get over these obstacles so beautifully. And it's a challenge. It's an interesting challenge. It's not like, oh my God, I'm going to hit this thing. It's an interesting and hard and fun thing to get over a hurdle. So I would encourage you to think differently about them. Like, it's not a wall, it's a hurdle. And you have to be flexible and good to get over it. So
so back to this kind of Rorschach test of what do we make out of this title. So when we talked about it, we realized, hurdles, as Liz said, they're not the thing. The thing is what you're trying to achieve. The hurdle happens to be something that maybe is unexpected, it shows up in your way. And I like actually that analogy that a lot of, I think, advancing in your career is understanding how to gracefully overcome hurdles and not to view hurdles as something that necessarily is going to impede your progress. It's something that, yes, you're going to have to put some effort in that maybe you didn't anticipate, or maybe it's not going to be as simple as you thought, but ultimately you're going to overcome it and you're going to be moving toward your goal. So a lot of what we're going to talk about, I think, is more thinking about your objectives and then kind of hurdles in the context of objectives that you're trying to achieve. So this was we started to just put down a list of things that we thought might be worth talking about, where we in our career have experienced hurdles, and we've had to kind of pivot or change or address them in some way or another. And you can see, as any good academic, I was still working on my slides as Greg Morissette was talking, so I already changed my slide to talk about making luck. And I think that's actually a great analogy. Like in my career, I think a lot of what I've done has been, I feel lucky as he does, but if you look at it, a lot of it is kind of setting up the right conditions so that you have opportunities, and luck really is just an opportunity that presents itself at the right time. So one of the first things that we started to think about, and you know, I've started to kind of go back over my career and think about this too, is when you think of this making luck or creating opportunities, it's this question of how strategic versus how opportunistic to be. And you know, in the context of hurdles, you know, it's very easy to say, this is where I want to go, this is absolutely where I want to go, I'm going to get there no matter what. And you know, as soon as you start to draw a straight line from where you are to something you're going to try to get to, it's inevitable that hurdles will come up, because it's just rare that there's some obstacle-free path that you get to walk along. And it's probably not apparent. Like if you look at people who are highly successful and you kind of hear them talk about their career, it just seems like everything just flowed and it happened to them. And it really is never that way. It's just, in hindsight, we forget about all the hurdles and challenges, and we just kind of remember the things that we accomplished. But so, you know, being strategic really does kind of put you in a position where you know where you want to go, but there's going to be headwinds to get there. On the other hand, you can be very opportunistic, and in some sense, being opportunistic allows you to avoid hurdles, because it's an opportunity almost by definition. There's no hurdle there. It's sitting there in front of you. And a lot of what I think is important in your career is to somehow strike that right balance of being opportunistic, but also of being strategic, but also being opportunistic. So I was thinking about this, you know, so I transitioned from Yale to Hopkins, you know, after about 8 years. And the fact was, when I joined Yale in terms of hurdles, you know, most of you would join a school, and I'm sure many of you, you're thinking, well, your big hurdle is tenure. Like, you know, in your mind, you wake up in the morning, and if you think of, you know, the horizon, you know, tenure is out there somewhere. Well, when I joined the Yale faculty, one of the first things they said to me at that time was, just so you know, you are not tenure track faculty. We don't have a notion of tenure track faculty. You're teaching faculty. And the only way that you would get tenure here is you would have to be rehired into your job as a tenured faculty member in a worldwide search. So don't think of yourself as being on the tenure track. So this obviously presented a hurdle, because you know, I didn't actually have you know, there was no path ahead of me anymore. There's kind of this indistinguishable horizon. But in many ways, it also created an opportunity for me, because what it really meant is I was kind of free to say, okay, how do I want to shape my career in such a way that after 5, 6, 7, 8 years, I know that if I were to go out and I were to be looking for a different position, I would be in a good position to do that, as opposed to saying, okay, I need to be thinking about how am I going to make this particular faculty happy and give them tenure. So it was actually kind of a freeing thing when I started to look at the positive side. And then the opportunistic side, so strategically I decided, okay, I need to find an area that is going to be broadly attractive to people. And the opportunistic piece of it was that when I'd done my dissertation, I had kind of a multifaceted dissertation. And when I was on the job market, I was pitching one piece of it. And it was clear that it wasn't a piece that was really getting a lot of traction in a lot of departments. And so I kind of knew I needed to do something different. So I decided to kind of switch areas fairly early in my career. And as part of doing that, I decided to co-organize a workshop at a conference in this area. And it turned out just by chance that that workshop ended up being the largest workshop at the conference. It was standing room only, overflowing. It was clearly we had kind of hit a chord. And so that was kind of a validation that said, you know what, here is an opportunity space. Yes, I could continue to do what I've been doing and what I kind of have a reputation for, But if there's this much interest in the field, that's going to be a place I can go that a lot of people are going to be interested in it. It's something I like doing. And so I literally pivoted at that point and pretty much said, this is where I'm going to be going for the next few years. And it ended up, working out well for me in the end. But I guess that just personally is kind of an example of, a hurdle, realizing I needed to have a strategy, seeing an opportunity, that opportunity aligned with the strategy I had, and kind of seizing that at the moment and following it. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Liz,
So just connecting with that and riffing off of some of the things that Greg said this morning, there's also the issue of being strategic in terms of your research portfolio. It's possible to make all of your choices pre-tenure looking at what that tenure case is going to look like and being what you think they want you to look like. And you won't be happy. You won't be doing good work. You should do what you love. So it's very, very hard to strike that balance between being strategic enough so that you cultivate the letter writers, yada, yada, and doing what you love. Because if you're doing stuff you don't like to do, and we're going to get down to this, that's the segue here. If you're just doing stuff because you think you have to do it, you're not going to be happy and you're not going to do good work. And that's really important. Another riff to connect to this and to what Greg was talking about, I actually, and I gave Margot Seltzer one, I made up a stamp. I went to a stamp store and I said, I want a stamp that says in big red letters, no. And I actually, one of my friends, another assistant woman professor, because we get asked to do a lot more service than the guys do, because every committee needs a girl in it. Someone saw my stamp and said, oh, wow, I want one of those. So I had about 10 made up, and I gave them to all the women assistant professors in the College of Engineering in Colorado. And for a couple weeks after that, all the flyers by the elevators had little no stamps on them. Nope, 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 nope. It was like this little, this sub rosa for the sorority. That was fun. And for a while, I actually kept a list of all the things I'd said no to. And that was incredible. Like, my God, what my life would have been like if I'd said yes to all of that. So these are just some strategies. And that's going to what you want to do versus what you have to do. And especially in research, it is critically important to do what you want to do. That's, and if this is what you want to do and this is what you have to do, I would argue for this. And if, like Greg said, if you're doing this and they don't want to keep you, it's not the right place for you. Okay? Easy to say. I actually managed to still say that all the way up to my tenure case, but that's different for different personalities. So yes and no. Greg actually told me something interesting while we were sitting outside finishing our slides 10 minutes ago. He actually keeps a spreadsheet of everything he's committed to do and everything, all kinds of research plans 3 years into the future. I'm like, I couldn't do that, but that's quite amazing. Maybe you can.
Let's not over-embroider. No, what I did, so this is something, and I've fallen off this wagon, but it's actually not a bad way to think of it. So part of the problem we have is you're always getting, in this no vein, there's always the next best thing to do. Like you just got asked to do associate editor in this journal. That's great, I'm now an associate editor in a journal, but now somebody says, well, hey, here's this other opportunity, and you're like, well, actually, that's better than the associate editor, but I already committed to associate editor. But it's okay, I've got the time to do this. And so you kind of accumulate these commitments, and it's very hard, it's very abstract to think, what am I actually committed to? And so I literally started a spreadsheet that goes 3 years in the future, where when I say yes to something, I say, okay, I know in 2019 I'm going to end up devoting 2 weeks to being awards chair for this conference or whatever it is. And I do actually try to occasionally fill this out because it's very illuminating when you look and you realize you've committed already a month of your life to things 3 years in the future. And it's only 3 years in the future that this suddenly occurs to you that you've done this. So it is it is a useful exercise to say, what am I actually committing to? And if you're going to put a limit on it and say, look, I'm only going to do this much service, for example, and I've already committed 80% of my time 2 years out, it starts to make you think a little bit more about these yeses and nos and what you want to say yes or no to.
And if you don't want to bother with the spreadsheet, you can use my advisor's rule, which is whenever anybody asks you to do something, you say to yourself, what if it were tomorrow? What if it were tomorrow? How would I be feeling today about that thing that I have to do tomorrow that I committed to 3 years ago or 6 months ago? Okay, so that's very important. So I think we've covered a lot of this. Altruism versus focusing on your own interests. I kind of derailed my research career being chair as an associate professor, and I never quite recovered. And I realized a couple of years ago that that was what was going on, and so it's been 15 years of doing too much service, so I don't think I'm a very good person to answer that, so I will hand that over to Greg.
I don't know if I'm a good example of that either.
Well, maybe that's telling, actually.
Yeah, it probably is.
Yeah.
Well, so altruism versus focusing your interests. I guess, there's obviously in any department there's a diversity of people that, some who are more interested and some are less interested in doing service work. I think the main thing that I think about is what sort of impression do you want to, it kind of goes back to creating opportunities. People will want to involve you and ask you to do things if they feel like you are a contributor to things. And they will tend not to want to involve you or ask you if you feel like you're in things for your own interests. And so I think, it's important to focus on your own interests because obviously you have to advance your career, but at the same time, I think it's important to engage and be part of the community that you're in, because that community is actually what's going to support you and advance your career. And isolating yourself from it is really isolating yourself from a resource. The flip side is, you do have to be selfish at times and say, you know what, I've got this spreadsheet and it says I've already committed to this much service, and I really can't do this right now because I have to make sure I have time for myself.
And the importance of following through bullet up there, we've both had collaborators who would commit to do things and then wouldn't follow through on them. And there's no way when you're establishing a collaboration to say, hey, are you the kind of person that does this? Because people just won't answer. So once bitten, twice shy, you can talk to other people who've worked with those people, or you can talk, the students know everything, of course. But I don't know if you have anything to add to that one, or should we flip forward?
I think we should flip forward because we're doing what we promised
exactly.
not to do, which is lecturing.
And yeah, I think you already talked about the first one.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a student right now. Greg gave us this advice this morning of find out early if they're not suited and cut them off early. She has been with me for 5.5 years, and it's only just coming out that she doesn't finish anything. And yesterday the email arrived that I'd been dreading, which is, could you write me a letter of recommendation? And I don't know what to do. And of course what I'm going to do is say the positive things that I can, but that letter is going to be this long. So I messed up. I didn't do that right. And the question that I actually had for Greg Morissette this morning that I didn't get a chance to ask was, how do you have those conversations? And I've been really bad at that. I've kind of let people, it's kind of passive aggressive. I've let them kind of flail around and then decide they should leave. To some extent, that's part of why we have prelims and graduate committees, because then the graduate committee, you can say to the graduate committee, hey, this person isn't working out, and they do the dirty work for you. But I don't know if you have any different experience on this with difficult students or difficult colleagues.
Deal with it early. I think all of us, I think many of us are conflict avoiders. We kind of think if we just let things go for a while, they'll get better. There's always, there's the day that it seems like it's better, and you think that's the beginning of a good trend. And then there's the day where it's not better, and we say, well, maybe not. But I would agree that one of the things I've really tried to focus on, particularly since being department chair, is to decide to confront issues early. And often that early conversation is both illuminating, because often what happens is you're building a model in your mind of what's going on with this person, but you don't really know what's going on until you confront the issue, and then you start to find out things you didn't know, and it changes the way that you think about it, and often changes the way they think about it. So it could be the beginning actually of an upward trend, or it becomes clear that both of you actually are kind of seeing two sides of the same coin, and in fact it's a good time to, again, engineer an off-ramp as opposed to waiting until it's too late, and now you're kind of both in this position where you've invested so much that you can't back out at this point. So the main thing I would say is deal with these things early.
Yeah. I saw a lot of nods when I told the story of that student. Have any of you do you have a student who's currently an issue? You wanna, yeah. What kinds of, I don't know if there's a microphone. Maybe we can do a bit of group therapy around this.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Lana Hiroshi, University of Minnesota. So the challenge that I have is that all of my students have some things they're just spectacular at, and then some things where they're really struggling. And it's trying to figure out the balance between those two and decide, okay, well, this student is amazing at communicating work, but doesn't want to do this part that's critical to research. So what does that mean? Or this student is just the most creative developer I've ever met, but writing is a real challenge. So how is that going to work? And so it's not quite so simple as saying, okay, well, this clearly isn't working out. It's, are they developing these new competencies, or are they capable of developing these? Do they want to develop these new? And in my case, that with this particular student, it was in the 4th year of then deciding to exit out with a master's. And ideally, that would have been in the 2nd year, right? So I don't know how to make that decision any faster than that. So maybe some advice on cases where it's not quite so clear cut, because there are some real strengths there as well.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I guess I would praise them for those strengths and identify areas where, if you have this incredible strength in having ideas, but if you want those ideas to impact the world, you need to communicate them more effectively. Does your university have a writing program?
Yes, but it's not writing at that. It's writing at the level of research narrative, not writing at the level of like English grammar or like making paragraphs. And the Writing Center will focus on that. Mm-hmm. It won't really help them structure a research narrative.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I had that student too recently, and the same one. Yeah, he just keeps going from school to school to school. And probably one of the most talented developers I've ever had in my life. And actually, he's in a very successful startup right now. So he found his path. But same thing, he just couldn't write to save his life. And I think, to me, this goes really to almost back to this altruism versus self-serving. So I stuck with this student. I've stuck with other students that have struggled in different ways. I have another student who's got his own unique, every student has their own unique issue you have to deal with. But they both had a commitment to say, I want to get better. That was the first thing. Like, I identified this early enough to say, look, you understand that this is an issue and we have to deal with this issue. And they both said, yes, I see that and I'm willing to work with you on it. That was kind of the first step. And the second was that, I could have cut them off early and said, look, this student's going to take more time than another student. But I just felt like they had made the commitment, they were far enough in the program that I was willing to invest the time in them, basically to develop them as a person, almost independent of what their research output was. And so I think that's a very personal decision of, are you at the point where you just need somebody to execute and this person's going to slow you down, and you just have to be a tough-minded manager at that point and say, look, I'm putting federal research dollars into a project that has deliverables, and you're just not the person who can achieve those deliverables. I mean, that's a fact of life. Or do you feel like you've got the capacity and you think that they're committed and in some sense it's going to benefit them and you enough in the long term to say, look, I'm just going to know that the student's going to take more energy and effort in order to kind of get them there. And that's the way I think of it. I've done both. I've told students, look, I just cannot work with you. It doesn't work. And I've done students where I say, look, you've got this deficit, but I'm willing to work with you because I think in the end it's going to be successful.
I think one of the key points there is if the person is willing, accepts that this is something that needs to be worked on and is willing to commit to it. I have to say, I'm not patient enough to do that kind of level of help with writing. I only accept people who can write. And so that's hard because sometimes they don't write the application materials, so you actually have to email with them and so on and so forth. So I saw some other nods, so yes, please.
So
name and affiliation, sorry.
Hi, I'm Pamela Wisniewski. I'm at the University of Central Florida. One of the challenges that we have is that we don't always get the highest quality students, and I ended up with one of those students who bounced around that he said that we should be wary of. And to give a little bit more background, we need to graduate at least one PhD student by the time we go up for tenure. And so I fell into that altruism versus self-interest, where I ended up just biting the bullet and writing my second dissertation to graduate a student. And it felt really bad, but at the same time I had to say, well, the other option is, you know, not meeting that metric for tenure. But at the same time, I have another student who started with me who was just not interested in doing research at all and wanted to be a programmer. And so I nicely told him he needed to just leave with his master's. And the one good thing about learning about that situation is we did it in about 2 years. He'll be able to get his master's. And he was actually really appreciative when I told him this. And so it's not always disappointing the student when you have that conversation with them. Sometimes they already know. And so hearing it from their advisor is helpful for them. So.
Does anyone else? I think, did you want to? Do you have a? And then we should probably.
Yeah, so I won't talk
Name.
about so much. Jack Sampson, Penn State. I won't talk so much about specific students. I'll talk more about the calculus of whether or not I, sit down and say to them basically you're fired, except you're not really firing them because you're not really their employer. So I will cease to fund you and you can go find someone else to work with. Part of that calculus is whether or not you believe you can actually get anyone who's any better to replace them. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, there is an element of staffing. Mm. And so if you have someone who is making progress, at which point you think sometime before the 21st century rolls around, they might finish their PhD, you really would rather not work with them, but unless you're going to get someone who's better, they're a warm body and you've got, obligations to do something with some of your funds sometimes. So it's
a very, very complicated problem. Yeah, and there's no if then else here, unfortunately, and that, especially when you're junior and not well known as the person in the department that everybody should go work with, that's a real issue as well.
Or actually, just to
yep.
briefly add on, and one of the things you mentioned was the role of the department in acting as a filter, mm-hmm. and sometimes you can hope that happens and it doesn't. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That's kind of a.
Yeah.
Is that a response or a question?
No, I have tangents.
But just kind of a quick response. One of the things that I always say about academic life is you're in one of two states: too many students and not enough money, or not enough students and too much money. And I happen to have just flipped into the latter state again. So I'm in your position if I've got positions open. Part of it, I guess, is also, are there ways, so when I'm in that position, I try to get creative in a variety of ways. And one of the things I'll do is I'll actually go around to colleagues and say, look, do you actually have a student who's close enough to the sort of thing that I'm interested in doing that maybe we could collaborate on a project? I happen to have funding to support this student right now that, it will go away eventually, kind of on the premise that if in the village talk that's happening across the way, if you can find a cohort of people that are willing to kind of play that game, down the road it'll probably benefit you as well, that you may be in the reverse situation and they may be coming to you with a chance to pick up a student that you have that you didn't have support for. So that's at least one strategy I take. And the other is, as you say, if the students are there and you actually think they can achieve their end goals, then, and you feel like you've got the time, then that's, again, it's this personal choice. Are you willing to do that, or do you think you can generate some other option? The other thing is there is always a no-cost extension. If it's really the case, you think like in the next year you might come up with a student, you can always push things out a year or two if you need to.
I have a
Name,
really...
affiliation, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Joseph Osborne, Pomona College. So I have a general question in a specific context. I know that a big part of getting, not in my case, but in other folks' case, PhD students to work with you is sort of almost like directly advertising and trying to recruit. So getting your research out there, making people aware of what it is that you're working on so they can apply to the school to work with you. Pomona College does not have PhD students, but occasionally we might come up with money to hire a postdoc or something for a little while. And in that case, I think the situation's quite similar. Like, convince the right person to work with you for a year or two on this thing. Do you have any like tips or strategies that you've used to sort of bring in the right people for the job when it's so time sensitive like that you need a specific sort of person on a specific timeline?
I usually keep an eye out at conferences I go to for PhD students who are giving great talks, and keep a notebook on them and call them if there's something like that.
Yeah, pretty much the same for me, except I'll nuance it by saying, you know, I obviously know the people working in the area, so I'll be on the phone to friends and colleagues all over the world just saying, I've got this slot. Do you have somebody who you think might be interested in it?
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Vivian Martin from George Mason University. I had a question about recruitment. Like, is there a way to get a sense if the student will perform well, or if they're just telling that they are really motivated but they cannot deliver things and then?
Well, the letters, I mean, the first part of an application, and almost the only part of a grad student application I read is the letters of recommendation, then I read the statement. I will not accept a student unless I've had face-to-face contact with them. Hopefully that's more than just Skype, but we invite all of the admitted PhD students, well, actually all the ones above the bar, to the university, to Boulder for a weekend, and we actually get to talk to them, and that's been a good filter. So no, you have to have personal interaction with them, and you know, read their email. If the wording in their email and the number of typos is very different than their statements, I would worry. You can ask them for a writing sample, but then they'll just, you know, yeah. We should just take one at a time. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Drea Barber, and IBM Watson Health. I just wanted to add on to that. So in my experience in my PhD program is really interesting because there are a group of us who were students, and when the new students would come in, within half an hour of interacting with a new incoming student, we could pretty much pick out who was going to last and who wasn't, and pick out, that's their professor, yeah, or you know, their advisor, yeah, for how long is that going to last? So there are certain things I think some professors don't see, and some feedback I got from someone who worked in our student services area is that they are often, they're the ones who see over long term, over many years, like what that, whatever, you know, standardized test score is or GPA from whatever undergraduate institution is, and how that kind of plays out over time. They're the person who maybe the student goes to if they're having trouble with X, Y, and Z, and that may be a resource to go to if you're trying to cultivate like a rubric or some kind of intuition around how to select students, maybe just showing those folks. So like the support staff who are actually dealing with the students, because there's some stuff there that I think as professors, or, you know, faculty are just not seeing. So.
Yeah, and you can also ask them technical questions over Skype. I mean, you've heard, I'm sure everyone's heard about the Google interviews. You could ask them a question to see how they think, and maybe you have the same question you ask a whole bunch of people, and you can kind of, you know.
Hi, Roy Schwartz from the University of Washington. I have a question regarding the previous discussion. You talked about false positives in a way, kind of you admitted a student who is not a great fit for the program. I was wondering, what about the false negatives and what's the proportion there? I mean, kind of in the sense that the students started slow, like the first 2 years wasn't doing really well, but then ended up finishing not necessarily with a spectacular PhD, but with a decent amount of work and with another example, this person started without any or very little capability of writing good papers and finished gaining this skill, and kind of something you're proud of that you helped him or her achieve that goal. So what's the balance here between people who are just not meant to be there or slower beginners, I guess?
The problem for false negatives is if I judge them as negative, I didn't take them on, so I don't have any data on that, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, again, a lot of these things are personal. So I can say that, you know, counter to Greg's advice, I have taken on students that have been discarded for various reasons by other faculty. And I would say that about 1 in 3 of those students, in my experience, ends up being actually spectacularly good. And it just turned out not to be, you know, as you say, either not a good personality match, or they started slow, or or something like that. Maybe a better way to think of it is, so every grad student kind of has their own trajectory. And my experience is that most students really start to pick up speed in about year 3, where suddenly they're focused on a project, they've gotten to the point that they understand the space, and they can accelerate fairly quickly. And in years 1 and 2, it's very hard to know what that acceleration curve is going to look like. And so I kind of go back to what we've been saying before. Like I Skype interview all my students before they come in. I actually bring them all in for a personal interview. One of my favorite little questions is I put on the board, I say, here's a simple linear system, AX equals 0. Tell me what you know about that linear system. And it's really illuminating to see, and I look, obviously they've had to have linear algebra. It's really illuminating to see how many of them actually can think their way out of something that's like a trivial problem and can talk about it. So I do that. So I'm pretty convinced they at least have a technical background, that they are conversant, that they can talk about a problem. And then it's, as I said, it's really typically kind of year 3 when I start to see that acceleration. And the students that I've had that have been successful but were discarded were students that in that first year, for whatever reason, they just didn't get traction with a faculty member, flipped over to me, and we found a direction and a synergy that worked for them. So it definitely exists, but it's, as Liz said, it's hard to do a scientific study on it.
That's right, and I have had people that have been discarded by other groups, mainly because they couldn't find. One of my graduates refers to my research group as the island of misfit toys, because it's just everybody who can't find another advisor comes to me, which I love because then I learn all this stuff. But it's like, then the problem is I can't say, oh, well, you need to cite Joe and Mary and Sam, because I'm like, I don't know who you need to cite because you're working in an area I don't know. So that's actually been wonderful, but I don't think of those as a false negative.
I just wanted to throw in, we're talking a lot about students. We're happy to continue this conversation, but there are a lot of, in the realm of hurdles. I mean, student is a big hurdle. Getting your first research grant is a big hurdle. There are a lot of other hurdles, so don't feel like you have to continue the student conversation if you'd like to talk about what?
Difficult colleagues. Ah, yes. Where shall we start?
Yeah. Which colleague?
You turn off the recording?
What kind of issues? Yes.
I'm going through a long list in my head.
Exactly.
So still Lana Yarosh, still from University of Minnesota, which, by the way, an awesome department. So I don't want to make it seem like I have just a bunch of difficult colleagues. But there's always going to be some haters, right? And
some haters.
Yes.
They don't like your work.
They maybe might not like my area or might not like my work, or I don't know.
That's not computer science.
Yeah, exactly. How is this computer science? And
it could be worse. You could be in physics. That's not physics. That's everything.
Right. Exactly. And it's a minority of people, but perhaps, let's say there's a person who just doesn't buy it. Whatever you're doing, they just don't buy it. Could be the other way too. They might say, "How is this going to be useful to anybody because you're doing work that's too theoretical?" Whatever it is. And so, is it what is the better strategy? Is a better strategy to just ignore this person and focus on your allies? Is a better strategy to try to educate them and convert them? Is what should I be doing with my energy around this minority people that might be 1 or 2 people in the department who are just not into what I do?
Do you have a mentor?
I have several.
Okay, then you might bring this to the attention of your mentor, because if they're a hater, you're never going to make any impression on them. And you can do really good work, and if they're not a hater, they might actually see one of your talks and say, "Oh, actually, there's some good stuff there," and wow, she got a paper in science or whatever. But it may need to be your senior ally mentors that kind of stand up for you in side channels with this person. But no, all you can control is the quality of your research, and you shouldn't be, at this point in your career, you shouldn't be responsible for converting everyone in your department, I would say. That's one of the roles. Just talk to Maria. She'll deal with them.
Yeah, Maria's an ally. She's awesome.
Maria will just deal with it. Yeah. Do you have any?
No, I agree completely. I think that's the case where every situation is kind of unique, and your local faculty will understand that person better than anything that we could generically say.
And they've probably had to deal with this before with that person, because that person is probably hated on other people, because it probably comes from insecurity, not from technical stuff. There were other questions before. Any other? Yeah.
My name's Matt Bates. I'm from University of California at Irvine. And I'm kind of thinking about the intersection of the last two bullets that are up there. And in particular, thinking about what happened, about sort of how to break up with colleagues who you've been collaborating with. People who you realize actually, you know, maybe this isn't the best long-term collaboration that we thought it was going to be, or where you actually realize that, you know, as in a junior position, you realize that you want to make your name in this, and with the senior person at the top, that's going to be hard. And how to manage those kinds of both conversations, but also how to do that in a way that kind of doesn't cause problems further down when you need that letter, you need the support.
Yeah. Do you want to start? I've been starting all of these.
Sure. Well, so just to kind of understand, so this is a senior person in your department, or?
Just a couple. I mean, this is not.
It's not like senior.
Sometimes it's just been. Sorry. Sometimes it's. I've had things where it's just like, you know, my direction is changing a little bit, and what we thought was going to maybe be a 2 or 3 grant cycle or something where we would keep going. Actually, I'm done after the first year or the first small grant. I don't want to continue. Sometimes, but I've also had situations where it's just kind of in the course of a larger collaboration or working with a senior colleague that I feel like I'm sort of getting the short end of things, and how to sort of manage that as well. But just what happens when you're in those collaborative relationships and they turn out to be more difficult than you expected.
Right. Well, so I mean, there I guess there's 2 pieces to that then. So one is, how do you manage the relationship? Because obviously you'd like it to end well as opposed to poorly. And so I think that, you know, the key thing there is to, you know, articulate some clear goals for the collaboration, but maybe try to frame those goals as, you know, I'd like to get to this point, but then I think I'm going to shift direction and kind of, you know, define that endpoint as opposed to kind of slowly disappearing. The other piece of it, I guess, is, you know, if you, and this is where I think it gets trickier, because I actually have a couple of situations like this too, where, you know, there's a lot of overlapping Venn diagrams with people I work with, and I say, you know, I really don't want to work so much with this person anymore, but in order to do that, I'm going to have to kind of shift my research far enough away that you know, the overlap in the Venn diagram isn't too large. And so that's the other, to me, kind of trickier thing, is if you kind of really want to set out on your own, can you do it in such a way that you can kind of frame a direction that's kind of clearly distinct from what you've been doing with them? Or does that have to be part of the conversation? Or as you say, look, you've just realized that you want to go in this direction, you want to kind of own a bigger part of it, and that may just have to be a kind of a factual conversation of, you know, I'd like to do this, and it's important for my career, and you know, we should finish what we're doing, but I'm going to go off in this direction. But that's, I think the way I think of it is, it kind of goes again to being kind of reasonably open and transparent. I mean, some collaborations, again, it's kind of mutual, like it's clear you're diverging, and, you know, there's that last paper, and then you're doing different stuff, and it's kind of okay. But I think it's usually better if there's at least a conversation and kind of a clear plan, so that nobody feels like they've gotten slighted or blindsided or something like that.
But there's a piece of your question that's much, much harder to answer, which is, you're an assistant professor, you have joined a particular department because there's Joe's senior person or Josephine's senior person who's the best one in the field. They come to you, they want to work with you. You know, you want to say yes because this is an amazing opportunity, but then you figure out later that they are kind of, everyone thinks it's their work. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think I might have a conversation with my mentor. Again, I hate to point everything off on the mentor, but to say, this is, you know, I really want to work with this person, but you know, is that going to stamp it as his work or her work or mine? And I don't have the answer to that. I don't think anyone has the answer to that. I don't know if you has the answer to that.
No, I don't have the answer to that.
But I mean, that's we're telling you that there are some of the questions that you're asking that have no answers, that sounds frustrating, but that's the way of it. And so maybe what that means is to think a little bit about those collaborations before you go in with Josephine, senior person, and say, at the outset, I'm really flattered that you want to work with me. I think we could do some really good stuff together. There's this thing that I want to bring to the collaboration. Or, these are, if we had these answers, we would be divorce lawyers, right? Or divorce counselors or whatever. But yeah. Does anyone else have issues with difficult colleagues, theoretically, of course, that they would like to bring up? Yeah.
So not a difficult.
Wait, he wants the microphone to.
Not a difficult colleague question at all, but actually just to go to your pushing to the mentor question. What happens when the mentor overlaps with not a difficult colleague, but say in particular the most recent one? You go there to work because there are people in that area who are very good, and the person who's your faculty member is the person that you are collaborating with.
And the mentor.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I would ask my department chair.
This can happen.
Yes. Oh, it happens a lot because that's the obvious person to assign as your mentor. We and maybe we'll switch to looking at the web page at this point because I think we've gone through these. In our mentoring program, we try to assign mentors in the area and a mentor who's not in the area. So maybe you could reactively, and everyone else could proactively seek out a second mentor who's not in the area. Also, that broadens the set of senior people in your department who, at tenure time, know what you're up to. Okay. So this is a slightly focused version of the, at our mentoring program at the University of Colorado, this is on the web, I can give you the link. We, rather than come up with a document, yet another notebook that somebody hands to you or FAQ that somebody gives you a link to when you join, we have a living progress mentoring thing that sets a set of questions to ask your mentor. Because often people don't know what the questions are to ask their mentor. Often the questions you want to ask your mentor are difficult, so this gives you permission to ask them. So this is just, I'll put the link to this on the symposium webpage, but it's a long list of questions that you may not even know you need to ask. And of course, it's somewhat, I tried to de-Coloradoize it, as I took the acronyms for our grant office out of it, but I may have not done that properly.
You're saying you brought it to sea level.
I brought it to sea level, that's right. Ocean level, not sea level, but yes. So this is another, you reminded me of this because of the mentoring program. And so we try to not have the senior person who's in your area be your only mentor. I don't know if there's someone else you can seek out.
My time is mostly passed at this point.
I see. But again, proactively. And it's kind of like they tell you to go up to conferences and say, hi, I'm so-and-so. And you don't say, I want you to write a tenure letter for me in 3 years, but hi, I'm so-and-so. But Juris Hartmanis gets everybody to come up to him at the conferences. So it's hard. It's hard because, and there are also people at every department, like Maria, where this is a great person, and probably everyone wants them as their second mentor. But you have to, again, these are questions for psychotherapists, not professors. But I would urge you to say, and anyone who comes up to me and say, "Would you be my mentor?" I'm really flattered. So don't feel bad about doing that. It's a good thing. Any other difficult?
So I'm surprised nobody's brought up funding. I'm just thinking I have a junior faculty in my center right now who's actually faced, I was thinking of a number of hurdles. She just is getting her first NSF award. She's written a bunch of grants and she's fine getting that. She's had students who have flamed out in a variety of unique ways. So she's really had, kind of many struggles that she's overcome. But it just, as I was thinking through it, funding has never come up. So I guess funding is not a hurdle for junior faculty these days, or at least there's not an articulated question about funding that you'd like to ask.
I think I'd be terrified by this notion of the growth in the field and the flat NSF funding. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so glad I'm not an assistant professor right now. It's good in the back.
So I'm no longer junior faculty, but...
And you are where?
I'm Cindy Bethel at Mississippi State University, and I'm associate professor. We have these great ideas we come up with for grants, but we submit them over and over and over again to NSF and don't get funded. So how do you figure out where else to go? Where do you go to get the funding if you can't get NSF? I mean, like, I've had two NSF awards, but I'm going through a situation right now where I've submitted the same proposal 3 times and they're not getting funded. So it may not be a good fit for NSF, but then how do you figure out what are the other agencies to go to, and how do you break into those? They talked about that a little bit in the last session, but it's like, if you don't have those contacts, I know DoD is very based on relationships, and if you don't have those ins into that world, then what do you do?
Well, that was part of, as you said, what Nadia was talking about, how to she gave about a 5-minute lecture on how to build those contacts, and I don't have DoD contacts, so I don't know. But and then Greg Morissette said something about, I think it was Greg who said something about foundation funding. Right. Okay, and that's another option. Greg Hager has had a lot of NIH funding, and I look at those proposals that are yay thick, and I also get terrified. But maybe you could say something about. And if it's not, what kinds of things can NIH you know?
Yeah, I guess the first question is. When I think about funding, and we're going to talk about funding, I think, tomorrow too. Is it basic research or is it mission focused? And if it's mission focused, then the obvious thing is to figure out, okay, is there some foundation, agency, whatever that fits that mission? And then, what I tell people is just start cold calling. I mean, one way you break into these communities is you just call program officers and you start talking to them and finding out what they're interested in. I mean, the fact is that NSF is the agency where it's completely peer review, so it's really convincing your colleagues that you've got this idea that they wish that they had, and that therefore they better fund it because they wish they'd gotten that too. But as you go into DoD, also to some degree to NIH, a lot more. It is the personal relationships, but it's actually understanding what they're looking for and just saying, okay, is there a way I can take what I want to do and market it toward a direction that they want to pursue? And so, it kind of goes to this strategy versus opportunistic. Like you're saying, this proposal is where you want to go. It's a strategy. You're hitting a hurdle. Well, one way to think of it is, okay, you've got these ideas now. Is there a way that you can kind of opportunistically find some place to market them where maybe it won't be exactly what you wanted to do, but it'll kind of get you kind of vectored in at least partially the right direction. And once you've got your foot in the door, you've got the results, maybe you can actually build back toward something else you want to do. So I would say just start dialing for dollars and see if you find a friendly ear.
And something that's gotten a lot of traction for me is, hey, I'm going to be in Washington, can I stop by and talk to you? Because we evolved to interact like this, not like this or like this, and so the personal interaction, and this is their job. So don't feel bad about saying to someone at the NSF or elsewhere, I'm going to be in DC next Wednesday or in 3 weeks, can I come talk to you? And they like that, and it's their job, and that really is a better connection than just cold. I mean, cold calling is good, but in person is good too. What else haven't we talked about that's important? Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about departmental culture and when it's bad. How do you...
Theoretically.
Yes. How do you go about changing it without becoming somebody who's like dubbed as somebody trying to rock the boat or somebody counterculture?
You wait until you're senior and you cultivate allies one at a time, I would say.
No, I would agree. Hey, it kind of shouting into the wind is not a particularly useful approach. And I think Liz actually has exactly the right view. So when I was department chair, I'm very much a consensus sort of person. Like I'm not we're going to go here, it's my way of the highway sort of person. So I needed people on board to do things. And some of the things I wanted to do were, not the way we had done things. And that's literally what I would do is kind of onesie-twosies. I'd go and just kind of talk to people, kind of get a sense of how they felt about these issues, maybe raise some points that they hadn't thought about before. but do it in a kind of non-confrontational way. We're having lunch and it comes up, or this or that. And over the course of a month or two, you would kind of start to figure out where everybody was in this. And maybe, again, kind of strategic versus opportunistic. Maybe you can't get the thing that you wanted, but you could kind of get a couple of steps in the right direction. And it's a long game to change culture. So you just kind of got to find those people and those opportunities and take it step by step.
But that being said, if there's something that's toxic in a sense, that's violating sexual harassment or something like that, then it's a time to go talk to the department chair. There are levels to which things rise that you have to go in that direction. There was someone else over here.
Yeah, so we probably don't have a lot of time
Name?
to talk about. Oh, sorry, Lauren Wilcox, Georgia Tech. So first of all, I want to thank people for bringing up the things that they've been struggling with and their hurdles, because they all resonate with me. So this is very validating. One thing I noticed is that a lot of these are interpersonal, and one thing I think we talk about less is the intrapersonal hurdles. So things like imposter syndrome, being compassionate with ourselves, taking failure in stride, right? These kinds of things. And so anyway, I guess I just want to point that out and say that if any other people have internal hurdles, that I can relate to that, and that for me, one of the things I didn't anticipate in terms of hurdles were like just the immense patience that I'd have to have with myself, and kind of like looking at my own biases, right? Looking at my own kind of, how having to move from more of a perfectionist kind of mindset to being okay with things not being perfect. And so there were a number of things like that at least in the first 3, 4 year, and maybe continuing years, I'm still I see as real hurdles. And they're much harder to talk about, and they're harder to address potentially. But anyway.
No, absolutely, yeah. And thank you. And I concur. It's you guys are sharing, and ladies are sharing some wonderful things that anything anyone says, I'm seeing a lot of this, even if you can't see it from the back, I can see it from the front. But yeah, that's a tough one. My metaphor is the kid in the candy shop. Greg uses something else, but that's it's a kid in a candy shop, but the responsibilities and the load that come with this job are amazing, and we're all alpha. We're all alpha wolves, and that's a tough situation. And there's all these alpha wolves around you. It's very easy to get small, but that's tough. You're in this. You got the jobs. That means you're good enough to do this, and you can. But it's hard to convince ourselves of that sometimes. So thank you.
I actually would echo that. Just so you know, it never stops. So, it's not like I don't every now and then say, "Oh my God, what did I do and why did I do that?" So one of the things, and this maybe is kind of projecting a little bit in the future, is in some ways I think what will get more difficult about this job as you progress through your careers is that you will actually lose control more and more. So when I think about some of the issues you raise, as a center director, I actually have, in some sense, more of those angst or issues than I did as a faculty member. Because at least as a faculty member, when I woke up in the morning, I felt like I could take action to control whatever it was that I was dealing with. And as you kind of start to have a larger group of students, as you start to manage bigger projects, as you start to work with more colleagues, maybe eventually move into leadership, you have less and less control over what's actually happening. And so it's very easy to get into these counterfactual discussions in your head of, if I had only done that, then this would have happened now. And so I think you raise a really important point that you just have to accept the fact that you can't control the world and make it perfect for you. Good is a great place to be, and as Greg said, you do have a pretty damn good job. So just be happy with the successes and accept that nobody is perfect.
I recommend yoga and exercise. Greg said that. It's really important. Mm-hmm. We probably have time for one more. Did you? Microphone? And name?
Yes, Leila Barmaki, Delaware, University of Delaware. So my question is more about service, as I followed up on it apparently because it hasn't been brought up yet too much. And also about your no stamp. So we might start to say no to some service, but we have no clue about what's gonna be next. and we don't know, maybe we miss some of the opportunities. And whenever I ask for my department chair about what's gonna be another thing that I can say yes, she or he says like, what is your suggestion? Or it's a vague answer. So I just wondering, do you have any specific strategy for that? And especially you mentioned about you handed it to all female faculty member in the engineering department. So I think it's something that we should be more careful about. Thank you.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, just riffing off what Greg does, thinking ahead about your commitments, I try to always have room to say yes to one more amazing thing. So I always kind of have one slot open. So a little backup, yeah. But that's, yeah. And if your department, you can ask your mentor again. Sorry, punting for everything to the mentor because I care about mentoring. You can go to your mentor, and he or she can tell you whether that's an important thing. But there's no algorithm for GradCom is bigger than computing committee or something like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing, I guess, which I think is fairly obvious, is to the extent that you can understand what the range of service roles are in the department, obviously finding things that you feel like you're more interested or passionate about is the place that, if you have an option, you would obviously like to vector yourself. That being said, the way when I was chair, at least I thought about junior faculty was, I would always be trying to move them through 2 or 3 different committees, but as a junior member with the expectation as junior faculty, we don't want to overload you with service. And so maybe if you could look at the spread of roles and you could actually go to your department chair and say, here are like 3 places where I think I would actually be able to add value. You can actually kind of proactively start to vector where they're going to put you, as opposed to kind of they come to you and say, well, we do this, we do this, we do this, and you have no idea what the realm of this are.
So just to finish up, the next set of parallel sessions in this room is when and how to move into leadership, something to be thinking about. It may be a little ways down, and balance, doing it all while not working 24/7. That's across the way. And then we have lunch at 1 o'clock. All right, thank you all for sharing. This is really good.